People think a funeral is where the truth dies with the body. They are wrong. Mine is the funeral where the truth finally stood up, quiet, cold, and ready to tear through the people who thought they buried it. My name is Michael Turner. I was 68 years old when my son kicked me out of the lakefront mansion I built with my own hands. And though my body now lies in a closed casket at the front of Anderson Funeral Home, I am still here, watching, listening, waiting for the secret I kept for 20 years to finally break my son's knees. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe, turn on notifications, and tell me which city you're watching from. We share new stories every day. Now lean closer, because this is the part no one in the room knows except me. The air inside the funeral home does not move. It sits heavy, stale, the way grief pretends to be clean when polished with flowers and dim lights. Anderson Funeral Home prides itself on quiet dignity. I stand between the lilies and my framed photograph, the one Emily took last summer at Lake Geneva, when the sky turned blue enough to make a man believe life still had more chapters left. David is in the front row, left aisle. Of course he is. He always picks the seat closest to the exit ever since he was a boy who hated commitment and needed to know he could escape any moment he wished. He wears a charcoal suit that does not belong to him, too tailored, too precise, the uniform of a man who wants to appear important without earning the weight of importance. His phone rests in his hand screen, angled down. He is not checking condolences. He is checking listings, clients, interest rates, the market he worships more than he ever worshipped loyalty. He lifts his chin, glances at the closed casket, then back at the phone. 3 seconds. That is all he gives his dead father. Beside him sits Lisa, my daughter, every detail of her sculpted into perfection. The smooth black dress designed to photograph well, the hair sprayed into obedience, the expression that says, "I am here, but I am untouched." Her hand rests on David's forearm, not affection. A signal. A reminder. We are a team. We control the narrative. On the far end of the row sits Emily, my niece, who loved me more honestly than either of my children. She folds her hands over the funeral program as if it might break open in her palms. Her posture is careful, steady, the kind of quiet strength teachers learn when they know a single tear could unravel an entire room. There is no phone in her hands. Between David and Lisa sits Henry, their 12-year-old son. The boy tries to make himself small shoulders tucked inside a navy sweater his grandmother once knitted. He watches the floor because it is easier than watching the casket. But every few seconds, when he thinks no one notices, he lifts his eyes toward my photograph. He holds them there. He is the only one brave enough to look me in the face. The funeral director hovers near the podium. His shoes make no sound, as if grief demanded silence even from leather. He has already asked twice if the family would like to share a memory. No one stood. He will ask a third time. People shift quietly. A cough. The rustle of tissue paper. The sigh of someone who didn't expect a funeral to feel like a courtroom. A neighbor whispers Michael was strong with his hands, rough with his words. The whisper hops to another ear. Changes shape, becomes something new. I drift closer to the front, watching the lilies bow toward the casket. Flowers lean differently when they know secrets. David clears his throat. The entire row stiffens, hopeful or afraid. But he only says to Lisa, "Traffic on Milwaukee Avenue will be terrible by 3. We should leave as soon as this ends." He darkens his phone screen, resets his face into polite sorrow. He thinks grief is a performance. He learned that from somewhere. The director steps up again, hands folded over a leather binder. His voice is trained softness. If anyone would like to share a few words, a favorite memory can bring warmth on a cold day. He waits. David looks at his shoes, then at the casket, then at Lisa, who squeezes his arm, a warning, not support. Emily's fingers tighten on the program. She wants to stand. But wanting and daring are not the same thing. Henry whispers something to his father. David doesn't reply. He only pats the boy's shoulder and turns his eyes back to the floor. My mind leaves the room and walks into the February light. I see Lake Geneva the way it looked before everything fell apart. The limestone shore, the wind carving narrow waves, the world holding its breath. Laura stands beside me in memory's doorway, holding the mug of coffee she never drank because she liked the warmth in her hands more than the taste. Then the present snaps back. The door opens and a group from St. Francis Parish slips into the last row. Rosaries clatter softly against pockets. Someone whispers, "Such a shame what happened between him and David." And the house. Emily hears it. Lisa hears it. David pretends not to hear it. A crack runs through the room, hairline but spreading. Henry lets out a narrow sound, not yet a sob, but the seed of one. David reacts instantly, a hand on his son's shoulder as if grief were a behavior to be corrected. The director clears his throat again, a soft, resigned sound. If the family does not wish to speak, he says gently, a friend or neighbor is welcome. Mrs. Blake from 2 doors down begins to rise. Her hands shake. She sits back down. She remembers the casserole she brought after Laura died, how it sat untouched on my counter for 3 days, how the plastic wrap bubbled in the summer heat, how she realized then that grief was not something you feed with food. It was something you feed with truth. And no one has spoken the truth yet. Not David, not Lisa, not even Emily. But the truth is here, standing in the aisle, breathing down their necks. And the truth is simple. The mansion. David kicked me out of the one he believed he won. When he shoved me out the door never belonged to him. The papers he signed, the trust he thought he controlled, the accounts he drained behind closed doors. He never understood any of it. Because 20 years ago after Laura died, the first time in my heart I rewrote every document, changed every beneficiary, moved every dollar, not out of spite, out of clarity. And now, as David sits inches from the casket ready to leave early to beat traffic, the truth waits heavy, patient, inevitable. The funeral is not the end of my story. It is the moment the story turns on them. All of them. And before this service ends, every person in this room will understand exactly what David took from me and exactly what he never truly owned. I see the morning I told David he needed to come clean about the classes he had skipped and the loans that were past due. I remember the sound of the pen when I signed the refinance to cover the bill that was bigger than honesty. The director tries one last time. If there are no speakers, we will move forward with the commendation. He nods to the minister. The minister begins his prepared comfort about rest and green pastures and a table made ready. I step closer to Emily. Her eyes are wet but quiet. She breathes the way she tells her students to breathe when they think they are going to cry and do not want to. David glances at the clock near the exit. Lisa shifts in her seat and adjusts the strap of a black handbag I have seen at 3 holiday dinners and 1 graduation. Henry looks at the floor again, then at the photo, then at the space where a person would stand if they were brave enough to speak. No one stands. The service moves forward. The director signals with his eyes, and a staff member eases a small table into place to receive the guest book. Pens are set just so. People begin to rise by rows. The sound of fabric and chair legs and shoes on carpet becomes the only music. A woman from the parish tells Emily that her father was a good man who worked hard. Emily nods and says thank you. David shakes a hand and says, "Appreciate you being here." Henry drifts a step apart and looks up at the photo again. I stand in the space between the casket and the door, and I feel an old ache arrive without announcement. Outside the windows a cloud slides across the sun, and the light in the room shifts by a shade. The director speaks low to the minister. The aisle clears. The door opens. Cold air pushes in. I let the moment rest without trying to fix it. The room is doing what rooms do when people have decided not to say the one thing that matters. I can wait. In 1995, I stood with Laura on a scrubby strip of shoreline south of downtown Lake Geneva and tried to see a house where there was only wind and limestone. The realtor pointed toward the water with a practiced hand and said, "The afternoon light here never disappoints." I picked up a smooth stone and pressed it into her palm. The closing took place in a small office in Elkhorn. We signed our names until the letters looked like strangers. Afterward, we celebrated the way people from our side of town knew how. Meatloaf at a diner that had not replaced its linoleum since the year I graduated high school. Laura leaned back one elbow on the vinyl booth and listed rooms like a poem. A kitchen that faces the water. A bedroom with a window that catches first light. A small room for sewing. I nodded and felt the weight of the promise settle in my bones. We started with stakes and string. I stretched a mason line and Laura held the other end squinting against the sun while I marked corners with orange paint. An older man from 2 lots over walked over and said we were brave to take on a build by ourselves. I told him brave was a word we used for people who ran into burning buildings. He said he would come by with a level if I promised coffee. I promised and meant it. Measure, cut, lift, brace. Laura learned to swing a hammer without bruising, and I learned that patience thrives when someone hands you a screw right when you reach for it. We bought our materials from the Home Depot in Burlington and loaded the truck so high the tailgate begged for mercy. There were days when the weather did not love us back. A storm came up from the southwest and flung the tarp off the roof. We chased corners across mud and laughed without humor. I cut my knuckle on a stubborn nail head that refused to be flush, and Laura wrapped it in gauze with hands that had changed diapers and cooked through lean winters and never once failed to find a way. We made mistakes. A wall went out of square by an inch and taught me a lesson that cost a morning. I set a window too high and took it out. Laura painted a test patch the color of lake water and decided it made the room look like a hospital, so she chose warm white instead. We learned to forgive small errors because the structure was sound. The kitchen came together with a stubborn joy. We placed the sink under the window because Laura liked to wash dishes while the lake told her its weather. We set a narrow shelf near the stove for her spices, even though we did not have names for half of them. There were small dances when the radio found a song that had lived in her since high school. She would step in close, and I would try not to groan when my back reminded me I was not 25. We slept on the floor the first night we could call it a house. 2 sleeping bags unrolled in the living room, a lantern on a paint can, the lake whispering outside. Laura reached into her pocket and produced the stone from our first day and set it on the windowsill. I said that beginnings deserve a view. Years do not ask your permission before they stack themselves. Emily made paper suns and taped them to the sliding door in June. We grilled on the small patch of grass by the deck and burned more than we meant to. The house held our fights and our forgiveness and did not take sides. Laura and I argued about money with the kind of dignity you learn when you have to choose between right now and later. In 2008, Laura stopped sleeping through the night. At first we blamed coffee, then stress, then the way grief had stalled out on her after her sister died that spring. The doctor in Janesville was gentle, which made the news harder. Treatment came like a schedule that did not care about birthdays. I brought her to appointments and she teased me that people might think I was building a waiting room. We tried to keep our talk small. How are the peonies? Did you move the chairs in the living room again? Save me the good piece of peach pie from Piggly Wiggly. One afternoon she asked to sit in the sewing room. I carried her there in my clumsy arms and set her in the chair by the window that knew first light. She said that the house is honest. It tells the truth about what we did with our days. I told her that she had a way of turning a room into a voice. The parish ladies brought casseroles and I lined them on the counter. Emily came every evening with papers to grade and a bag of oranges. When the end came, it was quiet. The nurse touched my arm and the clock made a small sound that did not feel like time anymore. I sat on the floor in the hallway. Emily knelt and put her head on my shoulder and we breathed together. David stood with his hands in his pockets and stared at the baseboard. He did not cry in front of me. After the funeral, I walked through the house with the kind of attention men give to machines after a long haul. My fingers found the places where boards met and where a nail sat just a little proud because the hammer had decided enough for one day. The kitchen held its breath because it did not know who would stand at the sink now. A winter sun leaned through the glass. I went to the pantry and pulled the shelf forward and exposed the stud I had left bare for no good reason. I took a carpenter pencil from my pocket and pressed the point into the wood. I wrote a sentence without stopping. This house is our work and our witness. I slid the shelf back and rested my forehead against it. I called no one that day. I made pot roast that did not need to turn out well. When night settled, I walked down to the water and stood where we had stood on the first day, and I picked up another stone. I told myself out loud without drama that this place would remain what we built it to be. Not a stage, not a prize, a testament. In the weeks that followed, I learned the small tasks of one person where two had been. I fixed the porch rail I had meant to fix last fall. I cleaned the gutters while snow hung stubborn on the shaded side of the roof. I stacked the casserole dishes and returned them with thank yous. I found Laura's lists in the drawer near the stove and folded them like thin letters and placed them in a box with a lid that fit. At night, I sat in the chair by the sewing room window and faced the water myself. The house did not feel empty. It felt charged with a job. People think legacy is a matter of grand gestures. I learned it is a matter of care. I would keep the place intact. I would not let it be carved up by impatience or vanity. I would do the paperwork that living men forget to do. I would spare Emily from refereeing, and I would not give David an excuse to mistake impulse for authority. It asked for action, and time was ready to work. The first sign was a call from the bursar at the university in Whitewater. She said David had missed a tuition deadline. She said there was a hold on his account. She said he could not register for spring unless the balance was cleared. I told Laura they said what we already knew. I drove to Whitewater. David met me outside the advising office. He said the classes were ridiculous. He said the professors did not live in the real world. He said he was thinking about taking a semester off and working construction with me to make some quick money. I told him to finish the semester and we would talk. He said he was already done talking. He said the bill was due and he did not have it. I went to the bank in Lake Geneva and refinanced that spring. I signed where the man pointed. We walked out into the bright day. Laura slipped her arm through mine. She said we were a team. I said that was the only thing that felt certain. David worked briefly at a warehouse, then painting houses, then came to a site with me. Each time he quit quickly. He accused me of wanting him to be a copy of me. He said I liked the idea of him struggling because it made me feel useful. I told him usefulness has nothing to do with pride and everything to do with survival. He said I always had a speech. I said I always had a roof to keep dry and a bill to pay. When Laura got sick in 2008, the fights paused. David visited on weekends and learned how to talk around an illness. After she passed, David told me he needed to try something new. He said sales made sense to him. He liked talking to people. He said he would start with rental units in Delavon and work up from there. I gave him the old blazer from the back of my closet. 2 years later, he brought Lisa out to the lake house. In the kitchen, she touched the countertops and asked if they were original. She stood at the deck rail and said the view would photograph beautifully. She said her parents loved the water. She said that when she was a girl, they spent summers in Door County and the light at dusk had this same honest blue. Emily stayed after they left, helped me stack dishes, and said that Lisa was confident. David's career rose and fell. Some months he told me about 3 closings in a week. Other months he said the market was cruel and clients made promises they never intended to keep. He asked if I could help him cover an electric bill once when a client backed out. By 2013, he was talking about marrying Lisa. She came alone one afternoon to see the house. She asked if I ever hosted big dinners. She said the dining room had good bones but felt dated. She said she could see her mother sitting in the corner chair with a book, and her father on the deck with a glass of something he would pretend not to need. That winter, David sat at my kitchen table and asked me to co-sign on a small loan. He said he needed a newer car to show clients. He said appearances mattered. I said I wanted to see his numbers. He said I did not trust him. I said trust and math are different languages and both are useful. He raised his voice and said I was still trying to control him even now when he was a man with a life. I kept my voice steady and said this house had taught me the price of shortcuts. He stood up and said he was not my project. He left. They married the next fall. The reception took place at a venue in town. Lisa's parents introduced themselves as Paul and Margaret. Paul shook my hand and said I must be proud of David's drive. I said I was proud of the days my son told the truth about what he could handle. After the honeymoon, they came to the lake house for dinner. Emily drove out as well. We ate in the dining room. Conversation stayed safe until Lisa asked if I had considered downsizing. She said the house was a lot for one person. She said every time she visited, she saw maintenance that would overwhelm anyone at my age. She glanced at David. He stared at his plate. I said the house was work, and that work was good for a man who wanted to keep his back honest. Lisa asked if I had looked into transferring title to simplify things later. I told her the title was not a sweater we passed around to see who it fit. She said her parents had been talking about finding a place near the water, that they loved this shoreline, and that the family would make good use of a property like this if it were ever to be made available. David finally looked up and said they were only thinking ahead. He said it did not have to be complicated. He said I made everything harder than it needed to be. I told him that stewardship is not complication. It is responsibility. Lisa said that the truth nobody wanted to say was simple. She said I kept this house like a trophy. She said every window and every stair was a reminder to David that he had not finished what he started. She said I liked the power of it. She said I was a man who built a beautiful cage and then sat in it polishing the bars while my son stood outside swallowing the taste of failure. Emily set the bread knife down with care and said she would make coffee. David rubbed his forehead. I let my hands rest flat on the table. I counted 3 breaths and then 3 more. I looked at the chair where Laura used to sit, and I reminded myself of the promise I had written behind the pantry shelf. Then I stood and cleared the plates one by one, not because the meal was over, but because I understood that the evening had chosen its ending without asking us. I had wiped the counters and tightened a loose hinge on the pantry door. A car pulled up in the gravel. I watched from the kitchen window as David stepped out in a blazer that tried to make him taller. Lisa followed her steps, quick and light. Paul and Margaret climbed out of the back seat. I opened the door before they could knock. Paul admired the stonework on the steps and said a craftsman had lived here. We settled in the dining room. She set a leather folder on the table and placed her hand on it. David stood behind her chair with his jaw set. Lisa said they had talked everything through and that there was a way to remove stress from my life. She said the house was a burden. She said I had done more than enough. She opened the folder and slid a stack of papers across the table. David said it was a quitclaim deed. He said if I signed today we could file it in Walworth County tomorrow and make everything simple. I let the papers sit where they landed. My full name, my birth date, a parcel number that only means something to a recorder and a tax assessor. I read the sentences carefully. Margaret said she had seen friends make the mistake of clinging to houses and that it never ended well. Paul said they would make good use of this place. I asked who would hold title if I signed. David said that for now it would be placed in his name. He said later they could adjust to include Lisa and perhaps her parents. I asked what prompted the urgency. Lisa said her parents were exploring options and that this was the responsible moment to act. She said the market was favorable. I told them the title was not available. I told them the house was not a burden. I told them I had promised Laura that I would keep the place as it was meant to be. I spoke evenly. David did not like the tone. He said this was the reason he never felt free. Lisa gathered the pages. Margaret nodded and said time comes for us all. Paul said he could start arranging contractors next week. I stood and went to the sink and poured water into a glass and drank it while looking out at the water that had been my witness longer than any of the people in the room. When I turned back, I saw David sitting with his elbows on his knees and his fingers laced together like a man preparing for a hired negotiation. He said the house had stood long enough under my name. He said he was offering a chance for dignity. I said no. It was a small word. It did not raise its voice. It laid itself down between us like a piece of lumber. Lisa said the paperwork was straightforward. David said I did not have a choice. I told him he would not speak to me that way in this room. He stood fast and said I had never listened to him in any room. He said I was a weight around his neck. He said I was a burden. Paul said this was normal. He told me to consider the relief of handing over the keys. Lisa slid a pen across the table, and it stopped near my wrist. She said that if I signed now, we could avoid the discomfort of involving outside parties. I thought of the day Laura and I placed the kitchen sink under the window because she liked to watch the weather move while water ran over her hands. I thought of the sentence I had written on the bare stud in the pantry. I pushed the pen back to the center of the table with 2 fingers. I said the conversation was over. I said I was going to make coffee. David stood so quickly his chair scraped. He said if I would not sign, he would make sure this was handled another way. He said I had no idea how hard he was willing to push. He said he was done asking. The first rain hit the deck. Lisa gathered the papers. Margaret stood and adjusted her jacket. Paul glanced at the window and said the storm was early. Thunder kept its promise a moment later. I walked past David and stood in the entryway with my hand on the banister Laura had sanded until it felt like skin. I said this to my son, who, I said, you will not take what is not yours. He said I already have. Henry appeared at the top of the stairs in a t-shirt and socks, his hair messy from a nap. He looked at me and then at his father. David told him to go back to the guest room. Henry did not move. I went to the bedroom and took the small suitcase from the closet. I packed enough for a night because that is what my mind could hold. A shirt, socks, the photo of Laura from the summer the peonies would not stop blooming. When I stepped back into the hall, Henry had moved a step closer. He asked where I was going. I said I was giving the house some quiet while the weather passed. I returned to the kitchen and turned off the coffee I had not started. I picked up the keys. I told Lisa that the papers would not cross this threshold again. I told Paul that the house did not need his contractors. I told David that he could choose to be my son, or he could choose to be my opponent. He said a choice had already been made. When I stepped onto the porch, the rain came harder. My jacket soaked through in a minute. I did not hurry. Gravel shifted under my shoes. Behind me the door closed, and I heard the bolt seat with a quiet click. At the bottom of the steps I looked back once. Through the window I could see Henry at the landing, both hands on the banister. He lifted a hand the smallest amount. I lifted mine in answer. The rain put a cold line down the back of my neck. I turned and walked to the truck. The engine caught on the second try. Wipers dragged a clear path and lost it again. Then I put the truck in gear and rolled down the drive. The rain carried me south on Highway 50 past storefronts closed for Sunday and gas stations lit like lonely ships. I drove until the wipers slowed my thoughts enough to choose a place. The Lakeview Motel stood at the edge of town with a neon sign that buzzed even when no one looked. The clerk slid a key across the counter without lifting his eyes from a muted television. Room 7 smelled of damp carpet and smoke that had tried to hide under lemon cleaner. The bedspread was patterned with shapes that made no promise. I set the suitcase down and sat on the edge long enough to hear the springs complain. That night I stared at the ceiling and listened to the heater cycle on and off like a tired drummer. The rain stopped, but the sound stayed in my head. I thought of Laura's voice when she used to say storms always leave the air clearer. In the dim light I whispered to her memory that clarity was late in coming. I slept in fits, waking each time a car pulled in outside or a door closed too quickly. By dawn, I had decided the motel was not a place to heal, but only a place to pause. On Tuesday morning, Sarah Johnson called. We had not spoken in months. She had worked beside Laura at the elementary school library until retirement. Her voice carried the same mix of practicality and warmth it always had. She said she heard I was staying at the Lakeview. She said no one deserves to sit in a room that smells like wet carpet. She told me to pack my bag and come to her farmhouse on Lyons Road, where the porch still leaned but held. I hesitated, embarrassed by the shape of my defeat. She cut me off the way only an old friend can. She said Laura would haunt her if she let me rot in a motel. I drove out by noon. Sarah's place smelled of coffee and cedar. She had a spare room where her son once slept before he moved to Madison. The quilt on the bed looked like it had been folded by steady hands for years. She set a plate of scrambled eggs in front of me and asked no questions. When I tried to explain, she held up her palm and said there would be time later. She told me to eat first. I did because some orders are a kind of kindness. That evening, after Sarah went to bed, I sat at the desk in her den with a lamp that leaned too far forward. I opened the small fireproof box I had pulled from the back of my truck. The hinges squealed as if surprised to be used. Inside lay the documents I had prepared in 2010. Back then, David had already dropped out once and returned with debts he could not name without shame. Laura had just finished her second round of treatments. I had looked at her across the kitchen table one night and realized that if something happened to me, the house could be carved into pieces by impatience. The next morning I drove to Walworth and met with Robert Miller, a lawyer who spoke like a man who trusted words to do heavy lifting. Together we drafted a living trust. The house would not belong to the highest voice or the strongest demand. It would move according to terms I had set when my head was clear. I lifted the papers now and smoothed them on the desk. My name, the date, the signatures, the seal of the notary who had smelled faintly of peppermint. I traced the lines with a finger and felt the steady weight of preparation. David had never known. Emily suspected, I think, but respected my silence. Laura had read the summary and said it gave her peace. She told me then that love sometimes looks like a file folder, dull on the surface, but carrying all the weight of care. I had smiled at her choice of words and tucked the trust away like a safeguard against storms I could not predict. Beside the trust lay an envelope I had addressed but never sent. Tonight I took a fresh sheet of paper and began again. The pen moved slower than it used to. I wrote to Robert Miller, instructing him on what to do when my time came. I told him not to release the documents until the funeral, no matter what noise came from the family before that. I told him to explain that the trust had been tested by years of silence, that its weight came not from money alone, but from intention. I asked him to read my letter aloud if no one else had the courage. I asked him to remind David that a house cannot be stolen if it is already spoken for by a deeper promise. I folded the letter, slipped it into an envelope, and sealed it with a thumb that shook only once. I sat back in the chair and let my eyes rest on the lamp's narrow glow. Sarah's dog barked outside at something unseen and quieted again. I thought of Henry's face at the landing, the way he had looked at me as if asking which story would be true, the one his father told, or the one he saw with his own eyes. I thought of Emily, steady as a shoreline, too quiet to fight loudly, but unwilling to abandon me. I thought of David carrying anger like a tool he believed would always work. My chest ached with the weight of what I could not repair, but my hands were steady over what I could protect. When the clock in the hall struck 11, I placed the trust and the letter back into the fireproof box. I closed it, gently turned the key, and set it at my feet. I stared at the scuffed metal surface and whispered words meant for no one but myself. I said I did not need to win arguments in dining rooms or hallways. I said I did not need to prove my worth to people who had already decided not to see it. I said the house carried our labor and our love, and that truth does not need applause. It only needs time. My eyes caught the reflection of my own face in the dark window. The lines were deep, but so was the resolve. I stood, carried the box to the spare room, and slid it under the bed where shadows kept it safe. Before I turned off the light, I looked once more at the quilt folded on the bed and thought of Laura's hands, how they used to smooth fabric without thinking. I placed my palm flat on the dresser, steady, firm, and said aloud that I would not bend again. Justice had already been written. All that remained was to let it speak when the time was right. Parties are loud even when you are not there to hear them. I was at Sarah's place stacking the last of my clothes in her old maple dresser when the lake house filled with people who had learned to speak about beauty as if it were a purchase. I know the shape of that afternoon from the way neighbors later told their stories, from the details Emily allowed to surface, and from the few careful sentences Henry offered, like pebbles placed in my hand. I can hear Paul's voice carrying over the water, proud and round, as if the shoreline belonged to his breath. They called it a little get-together. Margaret asked Mrs. Blake from 2 doors down if she thought the dining room would be better with a long farm table and a runner to pull the eye toward the window. She asked as if the answer were already printed on a card. The grill smoked. The lake gave them its usual kindness. David stood near the railing in a navy sport coat and smiled in a way that did not break his face. Lisa moved through rooms like a realtor at an open house. She led a small parade to the sewing room and said it would make a perfect reading nook for her mother. Paul poured himself a drink and announced to anyone within range that the place had always wanted a proper host. He said that for years it had been a workshop for a man who could not tell the difference between sentiment and stewardship. Margaret stood with a plate balanced on her palm and said at last the house would sit at the center of a family that knew what to do with it. Mrs. Blake asked where I was. Lisa said in a tone she kept for difficult clients that I needed some time to adjust and that everyone processes transitions differently. She touched Margaret's arm, and the conversation moved on like a wave around a rock. Later, Mrs. Blake would tell me she wanted to say something and did not. Emily arrived late and brought a bowl of fruit that no one opened. She set it on the counter and said hello to her brother in a voice that tried not to reveal anything it could not take back. He hugged her with the exhaustion of a man who has already defended a decision more times than he can count. She stepped onto the deck and watched the water until the noise from the kitchen asked her to rejoin the performance. When Lisa waved her over, Emily said she needed to make a call and walked down the side steps to the narrow path that led toward the oak trees. She did not come back for an hour. Henry began the day faithful to an assignment only he understood. He slipped away to the living room where the air moved slower. He stood before the built-in bookcase Laura and I had measured and cut on a summer afternoon when the radio could only find one country station and a preacher. His eyes scanned the shelves out of habit. He reached for the bottom shelf where a row of old manuals and paperbacks leaned against a wooden bookend shaped like a sailboat. The flash drive was behind the paperback with torn corners. It was small and black and so ordinary it might have always been there. A piece of blue painter tape wrapped the body with 2010 Confidential written in my blunt block letters. Henry read the words and felt something turn in his chest. He slipped the drive into his palm and closed his fingers. He listened for footsteps. He looked toward the kitchen and saw the reflection of bodies moving like a pattern rather than people. He went down the hall to the guest room and shut the door softly behind him. He did not know whether he was breaking a rule by holding it. He pulled the old laptop from the desk drawer, the one that had outlived 3 versions of budgeting software and a dozen school assignments. The document opened in a simple font and described in plain language a living trust created in 2010 by Michael Turner for the purpose of protecting the lake house and associated property. It listed a trustee and a successor trustee, and named conditions that would make the piano keys in the next room go quiet if anyone had been playing. Henry read slowly, his lips moving, until he reached the line that said the property would not be transferred or encumbered by any party not named in this trust without the explicit consent of the trustee. He clicked Message. The screen filled with an image of me sitting at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a cup of black coffee. I looked into the camera as if I were trying to see who would need me later. I began to speak. Back on the deck, Paul lifted his glass and said the line he had been practicing since he stepped from the car. He said finally, "This house belongs to the Harris family." He held the toast long enough to invite agreement. David smiled and sipped and watched the lake like a man who wished it might swallow him or give him instructions. Lisa stood with her arm tucked into her mother's and said there would be new curtains by spring. She said memories are fine, but plans are better. Emily returned then and went straight to the kitchen for a glass of water. She looked around for Henry and did not see him, then stepped into the hall and listened. A single door was closed. She went back to the deck and stood at the railing and let the cold air braid itself with her breath. Henry sat very still with the laptop humming on the desk like a cat that had claimed the furniture. He reached for the drive and pulled it free. He held it tight until the corners pressed marks into his skin. He did not know what to do with it yet, only that the party sounded wrong and the drive sounded right. He opened the closet and pushed aside a spare blanket and a suitcase that smelled faintly of cedar. At the back sat a shoebox filled with batteries and cables that had lost their devices. He set the drive at the very bottom and covered it with a tangle of cords. He closed the lid and placed the box behind the suitcase. He stood for a second and listened to the house. I picture his face when he stepped back into the hall. He walked to the kitchen and asked his mother if she needed help with plates. He washed 3 dishes he did not need to wash. He looked out the window at the line where the lake meets the sky and held that line in his mind like a string he could follow later. Emily picked up her bowl of fruit and carried it to her car and set it on the passenger seat and stood with her hand on the door until the cold reached her knuckles. The lake turned the late afternoon into silver. Plates clinked. When the last neighbor left, Lisa said the day had been perfect. Margaret agreed. David nodded and said nothing. Henry excused himself and went upstairs. Henry waited until plates were stacked and the last of the laughter slid into low voices. He went to the closet, pulled the shoebox forward, lifted the lid, and found the small black drive he had buried under a tangle of cords. Later he told Emily that his hands shook a little. He did not tell his father anything. The laptop woke slowly. He slid the drive into place. He opened it and found 2 files. A summary, a message. He clicked the summary and read until his lips moved without sound. A living trust had been established in the summer of 2010. The lake house and its grounds had been transferred into it. The trustee had duties. The successor trustee had duties if the first could not carry them. No transfer or encumbrance would be valid unless it met the terms written here. He scrolled to the end and stopped at a paragraph I had argued to include against the habit of lawyers to prefer clean bones to living muscle. The intent of this instrument is to protect the property from misuse by heirs who fail to act in good faith toward the settlor or each other. Then he clicked the message. The camera sat on a stack of books on the dining table, and the edge of a yellow legal pad cut the bottom of the picture. Laura sat already in her place wearing a blue sweater that made her eyes hold the lake even indoors. I sat beside her. If you are watching this, we began in the simple language of people who are new to machines. It means time has moved the way time always does. I said that we had made the house with our hands and our stubbornness and our days, and that we had learned how easily things get taken apart when no one is looking. She said the house was more than an address. It was proof that love can be measured in beams and nails and the quiet way people keep promises. I explained that we met with Robert Miller in Walworth to put the house into a living trust. I said the words slowly so later ears could keep up. It would mean the property could not be handed over by impulse anger or bad advice. It would mean that grief could not push anyone into a decision that would regret them for the rest of their lives. Laura said we knew our children might struggle. She said love does not prevent struggle. It only decides not to abandon people while they do it. She said if our children ever turned their backs on us or on each other, the house would not belong to them. It would wait for the one who remembered what we taught. I said if a child turns his back, the house does not follow him. If anyone treats this place like a trophy, it will slip through their hands. I told the camera that this was not punishment. It was protection. It was the job of a father to protect what a mother made sacred. It was the job of 2 people who built a roof to make sure it stayed over the heads of those who deserve shelter. I said the truth was already written and did not require permission to stand. She said that if you are our grandchild and you are the one watching, you should know we believed in you before you could spell your name. She said that memory can be a kind of inheritance. She said the lake would tell you when you were doing the right thing because it would sound like breathing instead of breaking. The video ended without ceremony. Henry sat very still and stared at the blank screen. Downstairs, a chair leg tapped the floor and someone laughed too loudly. He pulled the drive out and held it in his fist. He closed his eyes. Tears came because they understood what words were still arranging. He had seen his grandmother alive. He had heard his grandfather speak without the filter of anyone else's anger. He had learned that the story being told downstairs was not the only story in the building. He was 12. He had the sense to know that truth can be louder than any adult in a room, and still the best choice is to keep it in your pocket until the room is ready to hear it. He stood and went to the closet and moved the shoebox again. He did not put the drive back with the dead batteries. He slid it into the pocket of his jeans and pressed his hand over it as if checking a pulse. He washed his face at the small sink and watched himself in the mirror until he could make his expression plain. "Practice this now," I wanted to tell him, "since there will be nights when you will have to carry a secret without dropping it." He cracked the door and listened. The deck door opened and closed. The refrigerator hummed. Lisa's voice rose and fell like a sales pitch tuned for a dinner table. Margaret asked about curtains again. Paul repeated a joke about being a man who knew boats but preferred porches. David said nothing. Emily's footsteps crossed the kitchen and stopped. She stood at the window that looks over the water and held the counter with both hands. Henry walked down the stairs and stepped into the kitchen like a boy late to class. Emily looked over and saw his face and did not make a fuss. She handed him a dish towel. Together they dried plates that did not need drying. She asked if he wanted to stay at her apartment next weekend. He said yes and kept his eyes on the work. She told him she had to go back to school early tomorrow to set up a reading corner. He nodded and asked if he could help. Their voices sat next to each other without leaning. Later in the guest room, he lay on his back with the drive under his pillow. He watched the ceiling and counted his breaths the way a good coach teaches a nervous player to count. He thought about the sentence Laura had given him through the glass of years. Memory can be a kind of inheritance. He added his own line without saying it aloud. So can courage. The house settled. The lake walked its patient steps along the limestone. In Sarah's farmhouse, I folded the quilt down to my waist and stared into a dark that felt less like absence and more like a pause with a job to do. Somewhere between my breath and the quiet, a boy had chosen to carry what mattered without breaking it. He did not tell anyone. Not yet. He did the brave thing that looks like doing nothing. He waited. The room had settled into the kind of quiet that pretends to be peace, when the side door opened and Robert Miller came in with a leather briefcase and a manila folder under his arm. He paused long enough to speak with the funeral director, then moved down the aisle with the slow certainty of someone who knows why he is there. I had always liked Robert for the way he let silence do part of the work. He stopped near the front row, glanced once at the photo on the easel, then faced the family. The director cleared his throat and said the service would continue with any words from those closest to the deceased. He looked at Robert, surprised to find someone else holding the next piece of the day. Robert spoke without raising his voice. He said the family was welcome to share before he did what he had come to do. David said there was no need. He said there was nothing worth saying. Lisa placed a hand on his sleeve and made a small sound that could have been warning or agreement. Margaret pressed her lips together in a line that announced exhaustion. Emily started to rise. She said softly that she could say a little. David touched her wrist without turning his head, and she settled back into the seat. Henry watched from the end of the row. His face carried the careful blankness he had practiced upstairs the night he tucked a small black drive under his pillow and made a promise to the quiet. He looked from Robert to the casket, and then to me, or to the space where he believed I might stand. Robert thanked the director and stepped toward the lectern. He said that he had represented Michael Turner in matters concerning the property on Lakeshore for many years. He said he had come to honor a set of instructions that were part of the same care with which the house had been built. Then he looked directly at David, then at Lisa, then at Emily, and finally at Henry. He said that the man they were burying today had left more than they imagined. David tried to laugh and found he could not. He said something about tidying up paperwork and letting the day be the day. He asked Robert to save administrative details for later. Lisa sat straighter. Robert did not step back. He said he would be brief. He said that when a man spends his life building something, the law should be made to hold it as carefully as his hands did. He said there were documents that needed the air of the room as much as the roses did. He set the folder on the lectern and slipped a single sheet free. Henry glanced at his father and then at Robert again. He knew something no one else there knew. Robert said the first thing that needed saying was simple. Years ago, a living trust had been created and funded. He named the summer. He said the property by the lake had been placed into that trust with the stated purpose of protection. He said the trustee had acted and would continue to act in accordance with those terms. David leaned forward and asked what exactly was being protected and from whom. His voice carried a burr he could not sand down. Lisa added that family matters should be handled within the family. Robert let both statements fall to the floor without trying to catch them. He said the trust contained language about good faith between heirs and toward the settlor. He said the document made clear that no transfer or encumbrance would be valid unless it met conditions already established. He said the trust was not a fence for decoration, but a wall with a purpose. The words found David and stayed near him like weather. The director took a step as if to ask whether this belonged in the chapel, then thought better of it when no one moved to stop anything. The minister folded his order of service and waited with the patience of a man trained to share rooms with lawyers in grief. Emily lifted her head. She asked Robert if he needed anything from her. Her voice was cautious and clean. He said not yet. He said there would be time for that. Paul asked if anyone would like coffee. Margaret said this was unkind. She said the dead should be allowed a quiet goodbye. She said there would be time to talk about assets. Robert said he was not discussing assets. He said he was honoring instructions that were to be honored here in this room among witnesses. He said that was the point. The day belonged to grief, but grief and truth are cousins, and do not quarrel when they have been raised well. David rubbed his forehead the way he does when a client asks for a cut he cannot give. He told Robert he was making a scene. He said his father had always liked to make things larger than they were. He said the house would be better off in hands that planned for the future. He said I had refused to plan. His sentences stumbled over one another, small and sharp. Henry folded his fingers together and placed them between his knees. The USB in his pocket felt like a heartbeat. He kept his mouth closed and his eyes open. He had come to understand in one night that words do not always make truth bigger. Sometimes they only make noise around it. Robert turned a page. He said that part of his duty was to offer anyone who wished a chance to speak before he continued. He looked to Emily first. She took a breath and began to rise. Lisa reached out a hand toward her, half as comfort and half as restraint. David said quietly that this was not the moment to open old doors. Emily sat back down with dignity intact. Robert placed both palms on the lectern and leaned slightly forward. The movement brought his voice closer without changing its volume. He said again that the man whose name sat on the program had left more than most of them understood. He said the more was not only a set of papers but a set of intentions bound to those papers. He said that when intention and paper agree, the result stands longer than any argument. He said he would now proceed. A sound moved through the room that was not a word. It was the quick exhale of a gathering deciding to stop pretending it wanted polite endings. Robert closed the folder for a moment and rested his fingers on the cover. He looked at the casket and then at the photo and gave them both the kind of nod men reserve for other men who did their jobs without a lot of talk. Then he opened the folder again. The paper inside waited, ready to do what it had been written to do. Robert lifted the page and let the room meet it. He said in the summer of 2010, I created and funded a living trust. He said the trust remains in force. He said it holds the house on Lakeshore Drive and the rest of my estate valued at approximately $1.8 million. David leaned back as if a chair could catch a man falling without warning. Lisa straightened chin high, already forming the kind of argument that has more voltage than sense. Paul looked at Margaret and she looked back at him with the expression people wear when they realize they have misread a map. Henry watched with the stillness of someone who knows a secret and is measuring the distance to the moment it will no longer be his alone. Robert set the page flat on the lectern and placed 2 fingers on its edge as if to keep the air from turning it. He said the trust is clear, that the property does not belong to David Turner and does not belong to Lisa Harris Turner. He explained that a living trust is not a suggestion and not a hope. It is a binding instrument recognized by the court. When a house is titled to a trust, the trust owns it. No hurried signature at a kitchen table can move it out. No pressure at a family gathering can relocate title. Lisa rose before the next breath finished. She said this was wrong. She said everyone knew the house was meant for David. She looked to the neighbors as if the nod of a witness could erase a notarized seal. Robert kept his hands visible and his tone level. He said the trust not only conveys ownership, but sets conditions. He said there is a clause called no contest. He explained it in the plain words I had asked him to use if this day came. If an heir files a challenge to the trust, that heir gives up any share he or she might otherwise have claimed. To fight the trust is to forfeit. Margaret shook her head and said this was cruel. Paul muttered that lawyers find ways to lock doors families should be able to open. David rubbed his forehead the way he did when a buyer walked away on the morning of closing. He said under his breath that I would never cut him out. He said I would not do that. Emily let a quiet breath go, and it fluttered the edge of the program. She whispered that I had thought of everything not with triumph, not with spite, only with the relief of someone who suddenly understands a shape that had been hidden in glare. Henry's eyes did not leave Robert. The wave hit. He did not run. Lisa leaned toward Robert and told him he was using the law against blood. Robert answered that the law in this room served the intentions of the man whose name sat on the program. He said my instructions were precise. He said the trust had been funded and reaffirmed. He said records existed in Walworth County and in his file and in the title records. He said no private arrangement could overrule what had been done. A murmur moved through the back rows and then collapsed into quiet, as if the room remembered that noise did not change the shape of a beam. Mrs. Blake stared straight ahead and pressed her lips together the way people do when they wish they had spoken earlier in another place. Robert turned to a second page and did not read it. He summarized instead. He said the trust names a trustee and a successor. He said duties are spelled out. He said the focus is protection and stewardship, not convenience. He said the language speaks of good faith between heirs, and toward the settler the word he uses when he means the person who created the trust. David finally found a voice that could carry. He said we would talk about this later. He said the chapel was not the place for legal lectures. Robert answered that he respected the need for reverence. He also said my instructions called for this to be said within the service so no one would claim later that truth arrived by back door. He said the point of a living trust is that it lives in the open. Lisa sat down, and then stood again, and then sat. Paul swallowed and stared at the floor as if an answer were written in the grain. Margaret looked toward the side door as if fresh air might make facts kinder. Emily put a hand on Henry's shoulder and felt how tightly the boy held himself to stillness. Robert closed the folder and rested his palm on its cover. He said the paper was not the only voice I had left. He said there was a recording. He said I had asked for it to be shared in front of family and neighbors. He lifted his briefcase and set it on the lectern and opened it with a small metallic click that the room heard without wanting to. He drew out a slim laptop and placed it where the paper had been. Before he began the connection, Robert looked at the front row one by one. He looked first at Emily, and she nodded without words. He looked at Henry, and the boy met his eyes without flinching. He looked at David, and my son stared back with the expression of a man who is not sure which way the ground will tilt. He looked at Lisa, and she lifted her chin as if defiance could turn light into shadow. He looked at Paul and Margaret, and they each held their breath as if breath could hold time. Robert spoke once more, so no one could say later that they did not understand what was being done. He said the recording would reflect my own explanations of why the trust existed and what it meant for the property and for the people in the room. He said it would be brief. He said it would be clear. He turned the laptop toward the room. He reached into his inner pocket and brought out a small black drive. The chapel drew in. Chairs stopped creaking. A child in the back coughed once and then buried the sound in a sleeve. The projector washed the wall in a soft rectangle that looked for a second like winter light on a bare kitchen. Emily pressed the folded program to her chest. Henry's hands were open on his knees now, palms up as if to show he could carry what was coming. Lisa smiled a small smile to herself that did not reach past her teeth. David lowered his eyes and then raised them again. Robert slid the drive into the port and waited for the screen to wake. He said the family would hear from Michael now and then. He stepped to the side. The last thing I saw before the image appeared was the room leaning forward, a single body made of many braced for a voice that belonged to the past and to the moment at once. The kitchen came into view, the old oak table, the yellow legal pad, the window catching a sliver of Lake Geneva light. Laura was there. "If you are seeing this," I said slowly, "time has moved and I am not there to explain things across a table. I said the house was built with our hands and the hours we could have spent on easier things. I said I had learned how fast people can take apart what took years to build if no one is watching. I said we had 2 children and a marriage that chose work over complaint. I said when David stumbled at Whitewater, I drove up and looked a bursar in the eye and said we would make it right. I said when the bills did not blink, I signed a refinance and placed more weight on my back, because that is what fathers do when storms come. I said when the warehouse job wore him down to anger, I took him to a job site and tried to teach him the language of schedules and edges and men who finish what they start. She said love is the daily work of showing up when it is raining and when it is not. She said a house like ours is proof that love can be stacked and leveled and plumbed. She said if anyone in this family ever forgot that the house itself would remind them. I said there is a document called a living trust. The house and the land were placed into that trust in the summer of 2010, so they could not be moved by impulse, by pressure, or by a signature dragged across a kitchen table in a moment of heat. I said the trust speaks for us when we cannot. I said I am a strict man. I said I have spoken in ways that left bruises I did not see soon enough. The strictness came from love and fear, not from hunger for control. I said greed whispers that history does not matter, and that effort is owed to you. I said to the future faces in that room that if any child turned his back on the people who built this place, the house would not go to him. I said if anyone treated the place like a prize, it would slip through his hands. Lisa's breath came sharp. David stared at the floor and then at the screen and then at nothing. She said the point of a home is to keep a family honest. She said memory can be an inheritance when money cannot teach anything. She said if a grandchild was listening, he or she should know we believed in that child long before a single test score said anything useful. She smiled without sweetness, the smile she kept for the moments when a room needed courage. I went on because the job was not done. I said this trust carries a protection most people only hear about when it is too late. It tells any heir who chooses to fight it in court that the fight itself is the forfeit. I said I am not using the law against blood. I am using the law to bind a promise that began with a hammer and a vow. I said if you think you can talk the house into forgetting how it was made, you will learn otherwise. It remembers. I named the sacrifices so no one could pretend not to see them. Nights on scaffolding while my knees argued. Saturdays on ladders when the rest of the world felt like yard chairs and music. The second mortgage that walked into my kitchen like a stranger and left like a roommate. The overtime checks folded into a drawer so tuition could be paid and engines could be replaced, and the winter heat could run without complaint. I listed them, the way a mason lifts courses one on another, until the wall can bear weight. I also named the gifts. Emily's paper sun stuck on the sliding door, so every morning looked like June. David's good laugh when the grill finally lit. Laura's voice from the sewing room, while the lake threw diamonds against the shore. All of it paid into this place like deposits no one can withdraw. I said a man who has been given so much is bound to keep what was given in the shape he received it. My voice came down to a point then. I said if a child chooses disrespect, he will lose everything under this roof. If a child chooses love, he will keep the family. I said it as a person states the weather. In the chapel, Lisa broke. The sound came out of her raw and loud, no thrown like a stone. She said I was manipulating from a grave. She said I wanted to humiliate my own son. She told the neighbors that birthright meant ownership, that everyone knew it. Paul reached for her elbow and missed. Margaret shook her head hard, a slow refusal that wished to be a reversal. David's shoulders began to shake. He brought a hand to his mouth and failed to steady it. His chin dipped. He breathed like a man who had been running. Emily cried the kind of tears that clean as they fall. She did not sob. She let them go and kept her posture. Henry reached for her wrist and held it the way a boy holds a rope on a dock while the boat moves. The minister watched still as a tree in light wind. The funeral director stood with his hands at his sides as if ready to catch something invisible. On the screen, Laura lifted her hand and rested it on mine. The image held for a heartbeat that felt longer than it was. Then I leaned close to the lens so the room could not mistake my face for anything but intention. I said the truth was written and did not need permission. I said if you honor the love that built this place, this house will bless you. If you dishonor it, it will never be yours. The picture dimmed a shade. The camera had caught enough and decided to rest. The room did not move for a count that I could feel in my ribs. Lisa's breath kicked again, but there were no more words behind it. David kept his head down and his hand to his mouth, and the tremor moved through him like a wire. Emily found Henry's fingers and laced them with her own. Robert stood to the side of the lectern with the calm of a man who has watched many truths land and stay. The screen went to black and stayed there. The hum of the projector filled the space that talking could not fill. In that pause, the lake seemed to breathe somewhere behind the wall, quiet and sure, like a witness who knows the testimony is complete. Robert let the black screen hold for a breath, then closed the laptop with a soft click. He stepped back to the lectern, placed both hands on the wood, and looked at the family. He said the trust now speaks, and I will carry its words. He said the property at the lake and the remaining assets are directed to my grandson Henry. He said because Henry is not yet of age, a separate trust will hold and manage the estate until his majority, with a fiduciary appointed to act in his best interest and with court oversight available for any dispute. The sentence ran through the room like a current. Emily drew in a sharp breath and immediately reached for Henry's hand. He gave it without looking away from the photo on the easel. David made a sound that began as surprise and ended as something older. He looked at the casket, then the screen, then at Robert. Lisa turned on her heel toward the neighbors and lifted her chin. Robert went on. He said the successor trustee named in the document would assume duties immediately. He said the home remains insulated from any personal debts or claims, and any purported transfers executed outside the trust are void. He added that the trust's no contest clause remains in effect, and any heir who initiates a challenge will forfeit all standing to receive under its terms. Margaret whispered that this was indecent. She said families should not be maneuvered in public. Robert answered that families often do their worst maneuvering in kitchens and driveways, and the point today was not maneuver at all. The point was clarity. Emily leaned close to Henry and breathed a single sentence that only he heard. His eyes did not leave the photo, but he nodded. David stood, then sat, then stood again. He moved to the aisle and stalled. He took 2 steps toward the front and hesitated. David stepped again, came to the small rug before the easel, and sank to both knees. His voice was low and ragged. He spoke to the photograph. He asked for a chance to carry what he had tried to take. He said he had wanted to be a man and had been only loud. He said he did not know how to set this right. A murmur moved at the back and then stilled. The director lowered his head. Emily closed her eyes and pressed Henry's hand to her shoulder. Robert waited until David's voice quieted. Then he addressed the room in the same measured tone. He said there was one more housekeeping matter because the trust required him to defend it when necessary. He said a document had been presented to him last week purporting to transfer an interest in the lake house by quitclaim. He said the instrument appeared to bear signatures that did not align with recorded exemplars and included notary information that did not match the commission dates. He said the matter had already been referred to the county recorder and to the district attorney for review as potential fraud. Paul's mouth opened then closed. Margaret whispered that there had been a misunderstanding. Robert replied that genuine assistance does not ask a building to lie about who owns it. He said no one would be presumed guilty in this chapel. He said there were offices for that, and that those offices had been notified. Henry looked to Paul and Margaret, and then back to the photo. He held still the way a boy does when he is learning what the world calls justice and what it costs. Lisa told David to get up. David did not get up. He lowered his head further and touched the edge of the rug with his fingertips. The minister returned to the front with the thin book in his hands and the gentlest reading voice he could find. He spoke of mercy without pretending it cancels consequence. He spoke of fields and water and rest. Paul stood and tugged his jacket straight. Margaret stood with him. They walked down the side aisle with the careful speed of people hoping to leave the scene before a photographer arrives. Emily guided Henry to his feet and led him a few steps forward. They stopped beside David. She placed her free hand on his shoulder without saying anything. He looked up at her, at Henry, at the photograph. His mouth tried again to shape apology and managed only breath. Neighbors began to move in slow lines, filing past the guest book, squeezing hands, speaking the phrases people keep for days like this. Sorry for your loss. He was a good man. Emily thanked each person. Henry stood with both hands folded and nodded when spoken to. David rose. Robert approached Henry and Emily and spoke softly. He said the court would move quickly to confirm the fiduciary. He said he would meet them tomorrow to review immediate needs and to secure the property without drama. He told Henry that stewardship begins with small steps before it learns to take big ones. The boy nodded and answered in a voice that carried enough to be heard. He said he understood. Lisa took a step toward Robert. She stopped when she realized the room was watching. She picked up her purse and turned toward the exit. She left quickly. The minister closed his book. The director signaled to the staff. The casket would go to the coach and then to the cemetery. People rose and smoothed their coats and gathered their small kindnesses. Emily lifted Henry's hand once more, and he held on. David stepped back from the rug and stood alone for a moment beneath the photo. He bowed his head and touched the frame with 2 fingers. He said something only the wood heard. I watched the whole of it from that place where breath and memory meet. The law had carried what my hands had set, and character had begun to bend under its own long lesson. The house by the water stood where it had always stood, outside the chapel, but inside every sentence that mattered. The day moved forward the way days must, with gravity and the slow mercy of ordinary motions. Robert closed his briefcase. Emily gathered her purse and the folded program. Henry tucked his hands into his pockets. The door opened again, and the winter light reached in without asking who deserved it. The hearse door latched, the murmurs thinned, and the day shifted from ceremony to work. I stayed with Emily and Henry as they walked out to the parking lot and stood for a moment without talking. She put a glove on his small hand and told him it was time to go home. By late afternoon, the truck turned into the gravel at the lake house. Emily said they should start by opening everything. Henry went window to window with careful hands, making sure each catch held. Emily found boxes of photographs stacked beside the buffet and carried them to the coffee table. He held up a frame of Laura and me on our wedding day, the two of us still more hope than history. He asked if this one should go first. She said it should. They chose the wall by the dining room doorway where nail holes already waited. She hung the frame. My parents in a black and white photo. Emily at 8. David young enough to laugh with his whole face. Henry asked about the sewing room, if it could stay the sewing room and not become a guest room. She said it would stay. In the pantry, Emily noticed the shelf that never liked to sit flush. She pulled it forward the way I had 100 times and stared at the stud behind it where I had pressed a carpenter pencil into bare wood years ago. This house is our work and our witness. The fire in the living room needed kindling. Emily struck the lighter. I spoke to them in the way a house keeps a voice when people have learned to listen. The villa is only brick and stone. The real legacy is the lesson of love and justice. I felt the sentence settle on the room like a warm coat. Emily put the tea mug down and closed her eyes as if something had touched her shoulder. Henry looked up at the photos and squared his shoulders like a boy stepping to the plate. They cleaned without rush. Henry folded throws. Emily collected the glass vases Lisa had lined along a sill and carried them to the box in the pantry. She moved steady, not angry, not sentimental, only returning the room to the shape it had learned under a gentler hand. They pulled the dining table 6 inches to the left to center it under the old fixture, then stood back to consider. Emily said now it felt right. Henry agreed. Near dusk, Emily drove to town for groceries while Henry stayed behind to feed the fire and sort the last of the pictures. He found a photograph of me at the kitchen sink the winter. Laura lost her hair, my hands in soapy water, my shoulders slumped and squared at the same time. He set it on the mantel. The boy touched the edge of the frame, a small, respectful hello. Emily came back with bread soup and a pie. They ate at the table like it was the first night in a long time anyone had eaten there without performance. Emily told Henry they would meet Robert in the morning to go over keys and account numbers and a list of small things that make large things work. She said they would make a plan for repairs, not because the house needed to impress anyone, but because care is a form of gratitude. Henry said he wanted to help, and she said he already was. After dishes, they walked out onto the deck. The lake was a sheet of pewter, the sky a shade darker. Thin ice clung to the shaded edge by the stone steps. They stood shoulder to shoulder. Emily said she could hear the water breathing. Henry said he could hear it too, and that it sounded like a person thinking. They stayed there until fingers complained and then went into the fire. I let them sit without me talking for a while because silence can teach. Then I gave them the last part in the way a father gives a tool to a child and trusts the hands that take it. Sometimes justice does not need a shout. It needs time and the truth. I had written it in paper and on wood. Now I wrote it in the air of their lungs. Night came on. Emily tucked a blanket under Henry's chin as he fell asleep on the couch, and then sat in the sewing room with the lamp on low. She opened a notebook and began to list small tasks. Fix the porch rail that has always wanted another screw. Oil the hinges on the pantry door. Replace the cracked plate by the back outlet. She smiled at the last one as if seeing me there with a screwdriver. She wrote "Call Sarah" to thank her. Then she closed the notebook and set her palm on the quilt folded across her knees. The house settled around them. Pipes ticked. The last log collapsed and sent a scatter of sparks that traced a brief constellation before going dark. I moved through the rooms one more time and touched each place with memory like a hand along a row of beams. The hall, the kitchen window that watches the weather, the pantry shelf where the sentence rests. I felt the shape of grief and the weight of relief sharing the same chair, and understood that was as it should be. If you ever find yourself here holding the duty that outlives the man, ask your heart a question no ledger can answer. Who will keep faith with what built you? Who will turn love into care and not into claim? Who will remember long after the applause runs out? If you are in this place now, tell the world what choice you would make. Tell it not with noise, but with action that can stand a winter. Thank you for staying with me till the end, for hearing my story. If this story gave you a measure of courage, I would ask you to help carry it further. Like so others can find it. Share it with someone who needs a steady word and subscribe so you do not miss the next lesson we learn together. And answer for yourself, and in the comments, if you choose the question every family should face before lawyers ever get involved. In your place, who would you leave your legacy to, the child who scorns the love that raised them, or the one who still knows how to honor it?